In 1300 BCE, give or take, a young woman appeared before Egypt's pharaoh, perhaps in a palace at one of the royal residences, or a noble's estate in some provincial town. Wherever it was, the meeting was important. It would change the trajectory of this girl's life. The youngling was approximately 13 years old. She likely wore a long dress of high-quality linen, perhaps some jewelry at the neck and wrists. Her hair, whether natural or a wig, was probably a long mass of black strands, perhaps bunched at the ends with metal caps. Around the eyes, thick black lines of kohl accentuated her appearance, a vision of beauty according to the standards of the day. Before the girl, Egypt's pharaoh was an imposing sight. In his early 40s, roughly, he stood tall, bedecked in his panoply. The king had prominent cheekbones and a strong jawline. We can only wonder how the girl responded to this image of royal power. Was she impressed or nonchalant? Was she enthusiastic or anxious about the world she might be entering? However you imagine it, the appearance of Seti I, king of Egypt, would be a transformative moment in her life. After a time, the pharaoh nodded his approval and gestured to someone in his entourage. A young man stepped forth, clad in a simple kilt with a thick braid of hair down one side of his head. The Prince Ramesses, or Ramessesa, greeted the young girl. Himself barely 13 or 14 years old, the young heir was being tasked with a most important duty. If he assented, this girl would become his new companion, and ultimately his bride. They would produce children and continue the royal lineage. The young girl's name was Nefertari. In the course of his long reign, Ramesses II, pharaoh of Egypt, would have many queens and lesser wives. But amid the multitude, one name stands out above all. Nefertari, beloved of Mut, was the king's greatest or chief wife, and the most visible in his artistic and monumental record, thanks to the elaborate temples like Abu Simbel, and her stunning tomb in the Valley of the Queens. Nefertari is a household name for enthusiasts of ancient Egypt. Beyond the art, though, what do we actually know about this lady? Well, it's tricky. In some respects, we know a lot more about Nefertari than most royal women. In others, we know a lot less. But bits and pieces survive to paint a picture of this powerful and influential woman. So, let's explore the rise and reign of Nefertari, Great Queen of Egypt. Let's start with the essentials. What does her name mean? While we say Nefertari, the name is written as Nefret-Iry. There are two possible translations. The classic one is beautiful companion. Recently, though, linguists have suggested it should be translated as she has become beautiful. The significance of that is unclear. Was Nefertari a plain-looking child who grew into a beautiful woman? Impossible to say. It might not even be her birth name, but the one that she took as queen. Either way, the public image is clear. As a princess, and later as queen, Nefertari was, allegedly, an outstanding example of human beauty. So, beautiful companion, or the one who has become beautiful. Where did this paragon of attractiveness originate? That is surprisingly hard to pin down. Considering how much we know about the Ramessids and their origins within the milieu of Egyptian society, Queen Nefertari is far more mysterious. We have two clues that might be relevant. At the beginning of his reign, Ramesses made a grand proclamation at his father's temple in Abydos. Here, a hieroglyph text, usually called the Great Dedicatory Inscription, describes Ramesses' pre-royal life and career. Within that autobiography, Ramesses explains, in a roundabout way, The origin of his wives. Speaking about his father, King Seti, Ramesses said the following, quote, "He gave me a house of women from the royal apartments. They were comparable with the beautiful ones of the king's own house. He chose for me wives throughout the land, taking the secluded ones for me. The royal apartment was welcoming." End quote. Ramesses describes generally the creation of a new princely household. For him, there would be women, how many is unclear, and they would live in the apartments of his palace. Unfortunately, Ramesses was rather vague about the origins of these women, and he did not name any of them, Nefertari or otherwise. Historically, we assume one of them was Nefertari because she has such a prominent place in his royal court, but technically that is unconfirmed. And as for the places where these young women originated, all Ramesses said was that they came from throughout the land, and that Seti had chosen them. So we must assume that these women came from the general Egyptian population. Some of them might have been commoners, chosen for their physical beauty. Ramesses does explicitly compare these wives to the beauties of the palace, or Nefret-Iry. Other girls may have been nobility, the daughters of prominent and powerful families. More on that in a moment. And some could very well have been foreign, women sent to Egypt by petty monarchs in Nubia, Canaan, or Syria, or perhaps brought back from campaigns. Such foreign brides were relatively common during the 18th dynasty, and Ramesses II would revive this practice later in his reign. With that in mind, the young woman whom Seti chose to marry Prince Ramesses could have come from any part of Egyptian society, or even another community. Technically, that includes Nefertari. On the other hand, there is another piece of evidence that might be relevant to her origins. This one comes from her tomb, and historically, it's a strange one. Among the wreckage and ruins of Nefertari's burial goods, there was a small faience knob. It originally formed the handle for a wooden box, which is now lost. The knob is quite pretty. It is glazed, a deep blue, and it bears a lone symbol, a cartouche surmounted by ostrich feathers and guarded by serpents who wear crowns. Within the cartouche there is a royal name, Keper Keperu Ra, Iri Ma'at. That is the throne name of King I. I, the immediate successor of Tutankhamun, had been a prominent courtier before reaching the kingship. In that position, he might have produced a daughter, or more likely a granddaughter or great-granddaughter, who could eventually marry Prince Ramesses. Unfortunately, that is completely speculative. There is no record that I had a daughter or grandchildren, and the possible connection with Nefertari is entirely based on this random piece of furniture, but that may not mean anything. Perhaps somebody put this box, with its decorated knob, into the tomb as a way of filling out the burial. Or maybe the knob wasn't even original to the funeral of the queen. Maybe some tomb robber violating her monument happened to be carrying this piece and dropped it during their work. Again, entirely speculative. But you can see the problem. The fact that I's name, of all possible rulers, shows up in the tomb of Nefertari, that is definitely strange. And it has encouraged historians to imagine all sorts of scenarios where she could belong to that family. If we indulge in speculation for just a moment, let's say that Nefertari was a granddaughter, great-granddaughter, or some other relative of King I. If that were true, then how did young Nefertari come to marry Prince Ramesses? More specifically, why on earth would King Seti I choose this girl? If there's one thing we know about Seti, politically, it is that he did not care for the Amarna rulers. His king list at Abydos completely omits those monarchs, deleting Akhenaten, Smenkhkara, Neferuaten, Tutankhamun, and I from the record. With that in mind, why on earth would he re-legitimize the family of I by adopting a female descendant? It doesn't quite add up. On the other hand, the fall of a royal dynasty did not necessarily obliterate the families that had produced those rulers. Once I was gone, and Horemheb had started rewriting the past, the cousins and descendants of I's family may have got on board with the new regime. For survival, if nothing else. The winds of political fortune can change rapidly, so it's not impossible that a generation or two after King I, things had calmed down. And whatever his attitude to the kings, maybe Seti was still willing to placate a powerful provincial family. By taking a young girl to add to Ramesses' household, he might keep this nobility in line. Again, that is 100% speculation. Just because we can imagine a scenario where I's granddaughter, or whoever, might find herself joining the royal house, that doesn't mean that is what happened. Ultimately, all of this is based on a decorated knob from a box that turned up in her tomb. Not exactly the stuff on which great biographies are built. But hang on, I hear some of you ask. What about DNA testing? Well, it is true that we have part of Queen Nefertari's mummy. Surprisingly, the queen's knees were recovered from her tomb and are now in the Museo Egizio in Turin. What happened to the rest of the body is completely unknown, but the knees survive. In 2016, researchers working in the Turin Museum published a study of Queen Nefertari's knees, including the variety of tests they had conducted. Unfortunately, attempts to extract DNA proved unsuccessful. The human remains have been contaminated multiple times either before or since their discovery. So, at the moment, the knees are not giving up their secrets. Hopefully that will change in the future, and we might learn more. For now, it's a dead end. So, we don't know where Nefertari came from. But once she met Ramesses, and Seti chose her as a wife for his young son, Nefertari's life took on a whole new dimension. Playing the sistra rattles for her father, Amun-Ra, the lord of the thrones of the two lands, and for Mut the Great, lady of Asheru, and for Khonsu, Neferhotep. So speaks the hereditary princess, the greatly favored one, who possesses charm, the sweet of love, the mistress of the south and north, who wields the sistra while placating her father Amun. She is the rich in love, who wears the circle diadem, the singer beautiful of face, fair with the tall twin plumes, the great one of the music place of Horus, lord of the palace. One is pleased with whatever comes forth concerning her, who has only to say something and it is done for her. Every good thing at her wish, her every word is pleasing to the ear. One lives at just hearing her voice. The great king's wife, his beloved, wife of the strong bull, lady of the two lands, Nefertari, beloved of Mut. May she live. An inscription of Queen Nefertari, wife of Ramesses II, from Luxor Temple. Nefertari probably met Ramesses when they were both in their early teens. That is tentative, but we know they had reached puberty, because almost immediately they started producing children. The first child that we know of was a boy. The princess and prince, all of 14 or 15 years old, gave him a name fitting of royal majesty. The firstborn son was called Amun-Her-Kopesh-F, or Amun is upon his sword. He also appears as Amun-Her-Wenemef, or Amun upon his right hand, but the sword name is more prominent and consistent, so we'll stick with that one. Other children followed. Before too long, there was a girl named Baket Mut, or servant of Mut. Then a second boy, Pa-Ra-Her-Wenemef, or the sun upon his right arm. Later, a second girl named Nefertari, or Nefertari Jr. Then, one after another, 3 more children arrived. From the surviving inscriptions, it seems that Nefertari produced at least 7 offspring in the course of her life. 7 times she went to the birthing chamber in a palace or temple. 7 times she knelt or squatted atop the magical bricks. 7 times the midwives attended to her and guided her through the process. 7 times Nefertari heard that cry as the newborn took their first breath. Her feelings on this lifestyle are totally unknown. Was she enthusiastic, relieved when each pregnancy was successful, or was she overwhelmed, resigned to her life's path? Surely 7 children is a lot, and that's just the ones we know about. But Nefertari's attitude and experiences remain entirely mysterious. I'll leave it to you to imagine how she felt. One by one, Nefertari bore many children. As the pregnancies multiplied and the years went by, the princess, then queen, became ensconced in power. Naturally, she slowly accumulated titles and epithets reflecting her position at the top of Egyptian society. There's about 20 of these prominent titles. I won't read all of them, but the major ones include the following. As a symbol of royalty, she was often known as, quote, the king's great wife, sometimes with epithets like his beloved. She was also called Lady of the Two Lands, Mistress of the Two Lands, and Mistress of the South and North. Those titles are common to many of the great queens over history, but Nefertari also has distinctive ones. Not necessarily unique, but specific to her at this time. Some of them are surprisingly musical. For example, Nefertari was known as the, quote, one who satisfies Horus with her voice, the one who satisfies the gods, the pleasing of hand when she holds the 2 sistra rattles, the great one of the Kenner of Horus, lord of the palace. Apparently, Nefertari was a skilled and prominent musician, one who used the sistrum rattle, or sesheshet, to awaken the gods and draw their attention. She was also one whose voice was pleasing to the divine beings. And she was leader of the Kenner of Horus, that is, the music house of the king. There are a couple of layers to this. On the one hand, music was entertainment, a pleasant thing to have in the palace. Additionally, in the royal and temple context, music itself was a way of communicating with the gods. Like mortals, the deities enjoyed music, and a song could equally be a hymn of praise to the all-powerful divine. So think of Nefertari as being the leader of pleasantries in her palace, but also one who communicated directly with the gods. While we don't know much about Nefertari's origins, Ramesses apparently presented her as a skilled and effective queen. Through all of this, we get aspects of Nefertari's public image, but very little of her private personality. Sadly, that is the case for most of Egypt's queens, and their kings for that matter. Nefertari does leave a slightly larger record than most, thanks to her participation in diplomacy. In a recent episode, we witnessed Nefertari writing a letter to the queen of the Hittites, a lady called Pudu-Hepa. A clay tablet excavated in the Hittite capital city records a message from Nefertari. Speaking to her counterpart, she said, quote, thus speaks Nefertari, great queen of the land of Egypt, to Pudu-Hepa, great queen of the land of Hatti. For me, your sister, all is well. For you, my sister, may all be well. May the sun god and the storm god praise you, and may the sun god cause peace to flourish. I also am at peace, and in a state of sisterhood with you. End quote. Unfortunately, the diplomatic messages often follow a formula: introductions, pleasantries, well-wishing, and the exchange of gifts. We don't get much of the personal touch in this kind of communication, except in the realm of presents. Nefertari was generous with her gifts. She sent Pudu-Hepa high-quality linen and a gold necklace of incredible value. I spoke more about that in episode 223, if you're interested. The letters don't tell us much about Nefertari's personality, except that she followed the conventions and treated her Hittite counterpart with great respect. That's more than could sometimes be said for Ramesses, who could be blunt, manipulative, or even condescending to his northern brother. Apparently, Nefertari and Puruhepa were a bit more polite. One thing the messages do reveal is the likely pronunciation of her name. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs, the Akkadian cuneiform, which was the diplomatic language, includes more vowels in its script. As a result, it appears that Nefertari wrote her name in Akkadian as Naptera. That might be how it was pronounced, or possibly a translated version for her foreign audience. Either way, it's the one genuine piece of biographical information we get from her letters. As the king's great wife, Nefertari lived at the center of Egyptian political and royal affairs. Unfortunately, compared to some of her famous predecessors, like Nefertiti or Tia, the great queen Nefertari is much more of a background figure. Artistically, she's prominent. On temple walls and in statues, she often appears standing beside Ramesses, the classic image of a dutiful and supportive wife. Or she appears by herself, making offerings and interacting with the great gods. So on that front, on the walls of temples, she fills the same role as your average Egyptian queen. Politically, though, Nefertari is much less visible than her 18th dynasty predecessors. That doesn't mean she lacked power, but whatever influence Nefertari wielded was more behind the scenes than figures like Nefertiti or Ti. That might be intentional. A classic idea running through 20th century scholarship is that following the Amarna period, rulers like Horemheb, Seti, and Ramesses intentionally downplayed the role of their wives, or even limited their political influence as part of a conservative backlash, quote-unquote, to the powerful queens of Dynasty 18. That might be true, but there could be other explanations. The reduced role of Nefertari might simply reflect a shift in social or political circumstances. By the time of Queen Ti and Nefertiti, the royal household of Dynasty 18 was well established and expressing its power in some truly grandiose ways. Think of the sun god imagery of Amunhotep III, or the way Akhenaten focused public worship towards himself and his family. By contrast, kings like Horemheb, Seti, and Ramesses II all ultimately came from non-royal origins. Their power base was different from the older family. Based on the historical record, the Ramessid kings drew their influence from the military first and foremost, and much of their public imagery focuses on that martial aspect of rule. If there's one thing Seti and Ramesses loved, it was a good battle scene, with themselves as the warrior hero. For the Egyptians, that kind of art usually omits women entirely, unless they are helpless foreigners begging Pharaoh's mercy. While Akhenaten was happy to show Nefertiti smiting prisoners, and their daughters riding chariots on parade, Seti and Ramesses did not show their own families in the same way. From that perspective, the reduced visibility of the queens during this time may be a symptom of changing priorities in art and public imagery. It's one of the great challenges of Egyptology. How far can you extrapolate someone's political influence from their artistic visibility? For Nefertari, that problem is front and center in how we tell her story. On the plus side, we do have monuments. Like her famous predecessors, Ti and Nefertiti, Queen Nefertari has her own temples. In Waset, modern Luxor, on the west bank of the Nile, you can find the picturesque ruins of the Ramesseum, the king's memorial temple, one of several, and home to the colossal seated statue that we know as Ozymandias. Today, the Ramesseum is largely ruined, just its core sanctuaries, bits of the court and pylon, and some of the outlying buildings are preserved. Originally, though, it did have an extra shrine, one devoted to Nefertari. On the northern side of the Ramesseum, you can find the faint outlines of a miniature temple. It's not much to look at, just some floor paving and bits of columns, but once upon a time, this was a beautiful little shrine. Excavations show that the temple was devoted to Nefertari, and to her mother-in-law, the Dowager Queen Tuya. This complex may have been a kind of temple called a mamisi, a Greek word, relating to the birth of gods and rulers. If that is accurate, it would reflect the essence of Nefertari and Toya's religious and political positions. Above all, they were mothers to future kings, the women who secured the royal succession. As a result, they got their own shrine within Ramesses' temple. Finally, there was the big one. At Abu Simbel in northern Nubia, Nefertari has her own temple. Just north of Ramesses' Great Temple, there is a second monument that we usually call the Small or Petite Temple. This one is devoted to Nefertari herself and to the goddess Hathor. You can see that clearly on the front, where colossal statues of Nefertari stand alongside images of Ramesses. Nefertari stands with her right hand resting at her side, and her left hand raised and draped across her stomach and breasts. In that hand, she clutches the sistrum rattle, sacred to Hathor, and, in Nefertari's own titles, an instrument with which she was skilled. And on her head, Nefertari wears a significant crown, a flat cap with a sun disk in the center, two palm fronds emerging over the top, and to either side, a pair of cow horns framing the ensemble. This crown is common to Nefertari, but the cow horns connect her explicitly with the goddess Hathor. So on the facade of this temple, the queen appears as an incarnation of that great deity. Within the temple, you can find beautiful images of Nefertari before various gods. She stands with Jehuti or Thoth, Sekhmet, Ma'at, Mut, and her son, Khonsu. She also worships the gods of northern Nubia, beings like Khnum, Satet, and Anuket. But of course, the main focus is the goddess Hathor, lady of this temple. In one scene, Nefertari stands with Hathor, and also with Ise or Isis. The goddesses are either side of the queen, and they reach up to secure, or perhaps place, the crown upon Nefertari's head. The symbolism is clear, and quite appropriate for a Hathor temple. As a devoted servant and follower of this great goddess, Nefertari was in turn strengthened by the lady. Decades passed. Eventually, Ramesses II reached his 20th year of rule. By this point, Nefertari was in her mid-30s approximately, and on monuments throughout Egypt and Nubia, she appeared in splendor as the Chemet Nesut Weret, the great wife of the king. We know a lot about Nefertari's role within the court and society. What about her actual relationship with Ramesses himself? Unfortunately, that is much harder to answer. Historians try to work backwards from monuments and art. Certainly, we can point to the exquisite beauty of Nefertari's tomb, or the magnificence of her temple at Abu Simbel, as possible markers of Ramesses' esteem and affection for his queen. On that note, the most evocative text does come from the small temple at Abu Simbel, where on the facade, where the giant statues of Ramesses and Nefertari appear, a hieroglyph inscription proclaims that, quote, "The king, Ramesses, has made a temple, excavated in the mountain, for the king's great wife, Nefertari, the beloved of Mut, the one for whose sake the sun itself shines." End quote. A passage like that certainly evokes an idea of great affection and love, and makes a fitting dedication for an impressive monument. But that's just one temple. What else can we go on? The queen's titles might give us some clues. Various monuments include references to Nefertari as a greatly revered, even adored person. Phrases like Beneret Merut, sweet of love, Aat Merut, great of love, Dis Ibu Cher Reshut, one who causes hearts to rejoice, and Chenemet Iti, the one who is united with the ruler. Such titles give an impression of great affection, as they were intended. Unfortunately, these titles are not unique to Nefertari. You can find them in many reigns across Egyptian history, including for women about whom we know almost nothing else. That doesn't mean Ramesses and Nefertari did not care for one another, but we should always remember, when we see kings and queens on the walls of temples and tombs, we are seeing a carefully curated image, one that served important functions. Their union provided stability for the royal family. Their fertility guaranteed the succession and stability of the kingdom. Their social position as divine monarchs connected humanity with the great gods above. In short, the relationship between Nefertari and Ramesses does appear within a certain artistic, religious, and political context, and that affects how we imagine their bond. All of this is to say that maybe Nefertari and Ramesses did genuinely love one another. Maybe not. The public image on temples and tombs does give us an idea of affection. Whether that reflects reality, we'll leave to the imagination. Whatever the gaps in her life story, the name Nefertari has become one of the greats in the lineage of Egyptian queenship. And across the approximately 25 years in which she was the great king's wife, she enjoyed immense social prestige, wealth, and privilege. Eventually, however, all things would come to an end. And before the third decade of Ramesses' reign was up, Queen Nefertari died. We don't know the exact date of her passing, but it was probably around year 25, which would be 1268 BCE, approximately. That is based on a couple of factors. Firstly, records of Ramesses' Grand Jubilee, his said festival in year 30, describe a series of celebrations with several members of the royal family involved. Notably, Queen Nefertari is absent from those records, suggesting that she did not participate. Given her position in society, the most likely reason for that is that she was dead. Secondly, the fragmentary remains of Nefertari's body, which were discovered in her tomb, belong to a woman approximately 40 years of age. That would roughly line up with what we know of her life. If she was in her early teens when she met Ramesses, lived with him as prince and princess for a few years under Seti, and then reigned as queen for approximately 25 years, that would put her in her early to mid-40s at death. It's not a firm date by any means. The queen may have lived slightly longer or slightly shorter, but this ballpark figure of year 25 is the most reasonable estimate for now. The last known record of Nefertari comes from Abu Simbel. Sometime after year 21, the magnificent temples here neared completion. They would undergo revisions in the future, but the main building and decoration work was finished shortly after year 21. That is based on the spelling of Ramesses' name, which changed over the years. In one record, we might get a last glimpse of Nefertari towards the end of her life. To the south of the Great Temple, on your left when you are facing it, there is a rock carving left by a royal official. It shows Ramesses making offerings to a trio of gods, Amun-Ra, Ra-Horakhti, and Ra-Meses himself as a living deity. Naturally, the king makes these offerings in tandem with a queenly figure. She wears a long dress and a tall crown in the style of Nefertari's. But this royal lady is not Nefertari herself. Instead, it is one of the couple's daughters, a girl named Merit Amun. Hieroglyphs above the princess label her as the Sat Nesut, or king's daughter, with no other titles, so she's not acting as a queen officially, but she clearly stands in that position, being the female counterpart to Ramesses making offerings. On the surface, that's nothing unusual. It's the next part that is strange. Just below the figures of Ramesses, Merit Amun, and the deities, there is another layer to the scene. Here, Queen Nefertari does appear. This time, the great lady is seated upon a throne, and she receives prayers from the official who carved this scene. So Nefertari is present, but she's not participating in the offerings with her husband. Why? It's easy to imagine a variety of scenarios. maybe the scene commemorates the dedication or opening of Abu Simbel, a ceremony that Nefertari attended but did not participate. Maybe she was ill or no longer physically capable of performing her public duties. Or maybe the Princess Merit Amun was taking a greater role in religious affairs as part of her education and career. Or this may simply be an illusion caused by an artistic choice. The official commissioning the scene may have wanted to honor Nefertari individually by giving her a separate section to herself. Unfortunately, the hieroglyphs give no clues either way. They identify Nefertari as king's great wife, mother of the god, beloved of Mut. But there are no other captions for her or references to her role. It is terribly ambiguous. The inscription can be dated with some confidence, based on the spelling of Ramesses' name, which did change at certain periods, and also by the identity of the official who commissioned it. He was a viceroy of Nubia named Hekanakt, and his career is fairly well recorded. So historians can be reasonably confident that this inscription dates to sometime after year 21, which would make it the last roughly datable inscription for Queen Nefertari. Unfortunately, it tells us almost nothing, a frustratingly vague end to the Queen's recorded career. At any rate, Nefertari probably died around year 25, which would be 1268 BCE, approximately. In religious and symbolic terms, it was a moment of great loss. The primary wife, living avatar of divine femininity, was gone. She left behind at least 7 children, a mourning husband, and potentially a power vacuum. That would be filled in time, but in the days and weeks after she died, you can imagine some anxiety in the royal court. Following her death, Nefertari would undergo mummification. While her body is mostly lost, only her knees survive, royal mummies from the 19th dynasty are abundant, and they give a firm idea of the mummification process as she probably experienced it. First, the chief embalmer, or wheat bandager, stepped forward. He probably wore a mask in the shape of Anpu, Anubis. The embalmer inserted a metal rod into the queen's nose to scramble and remove the brain. Then they poured hot, melted resin into the skull cavity and stopped that up with a linen plug. Next, the moment of violation. A sharp blade, probably flint, cut into the queen's abdomen. The embalmers removed many of Nefertari's organs, though not all of them. They washed the body cavity with wine and inserted spices. Subsequently, they immersed the corpse in natron, either a saline solution or dried salt. For days and weeks she lay within that mixture, her body slowly desiccating. At last, the priests removed Nefertari from the natron. They rubbed oil along her limbs to restore flexibility. Then they wrapped her tightly in bandages. As they did so, the embalmers probably placed amulets among the layers of fabric, in the image of divine symbols like the Eye of Horus, the Jed Pillar of Osiris, or the Tiet Knot of Aset or Isis. These magical emblems would provide protection for the queen's body. Similarly, the embalmers almost certainly adorned the corpse in high-quality jewelry. None of this has survived the centuries, but other royal tombs, like Tutankhamun just a few decades earlier, give a hint at what she may have received. For example, Nefertari may have gone to her rest wrapped in long golden bands, which were adorned with her names and titles. At her wrists, arms, and shoulders, she probably received bracelets, bangles, and necklaces. And of course, Nefertari surely had a mummy mask, possibly made of gold. This piece, as lifelike as possible, would give the queen's wrapped body a renewed visage, with which her soul, traveling from the underworld, could identify her body and reunite with her physical form. Again, none of these pieces have survived, but they almost certainly existed at some point. With the queen's body wrapped and then placed within coffins, it was time for the funeral. King Ramesses probably led the procession as his wife went to her rest. The cortege would begin on the west bank of the Nile, most likely at the great temple which we call the Ramesseum. It may even have happened within that small shrine dedicated to Nefertari herself. Either way, the procession departed the great Ramesseum temple and set out on the road. They headed southwest, following the edge of the cultivation where the green meets the desert. The distance wasn't great, but the procession may have taken some time, as porters dragged the heavy sled on which lay the coffins and the mummy of the queen. Eventually, the procession reached its destination and turned right. They headed towards a wadi, an old dry riverbed that snaked its way up towards the cliffs of the western horizon. Here, the queen would go to rest in a valley that they called Ta Set Neferu, or the Place of Beauties. We know it as the Valley of the Queens. Soon, Nefertari's body, nestled within coffins, arrived at the mouth of her tomb. A dark pit, with a staircase leading down, opened up, ready to receive her. The king and his priests descended, bringing the body into the sepulchre. Around them, lamplight illuminated richly decorated walls. Nefertari's tomb was designed in the style of the time: stone walls, carved, then plastered, and painted in rich, vibrant colors. The flickering candles and lamps must have cast shadows over images of the queen and gods. Perhaps the play of light and dark made the figures seem to move along the walls. The king and the priests waited as the porters carefully brought the coffins down the stairs and into the passages. One by one, they laid these caskets within a magnificent stone sarcophagus. This granite box survives in fragments. It is now in the Egyptian Museum in Turin, Italy. The casket is shaped like a shrine with a curved lid, or roof if you prefer. Bands of hieroglyphs record the names and titles of Nefertari. And when that lid was laid onto the base, the queen's body disappeared from view. Nefertari was at her rest. As the porters placed the queen's casket and body into the sarcophagus, perhaps one of the priests read aloud from a sacred text. This text appears on the walls of Nefertari's tomb. It is part of the Book of Going Forth by Day, more commonly known as the Book of the Dead. Specifically, Nefertari's tomb features Chapter 17, one of the longest sections in the book. I won't read the whole thing, but as Nefertari goes to her rest, we can let some of those words guide her. Quote, "Formula for elevating and transforming, for going out and descending into the God's land, being transformed in the beautiful West, going forth by day. Playing the board game, Senet, sitting in the tent, going out as a living Ba or soul, by the king's great wife, Nefertari. She says, 'Mine is all in existence, alone in the Nun, primeval waters. I am Ra in his rising, when he began the rain that he made. I am the great God who comes to be of himself. I am unopposed among the gods. I am Atum who is within his sun disk, or Aten. I am Ra, shining in the eastern horizon. Mine is yesterday, I know tomorrow. Yesterday is Osir, Osiris. Tomorrow is Ra. I proceed on the road that is known to me, by the lake of the true ones. I reach the land of the horizon dwellers, and I go forth from the sacred gate. You, who are in the presence, give to me your hands, for I am one of those gods of the following of Horus, one who speaks as master, beloved of the Lord. I am that cat beside whom the Eshed tree was split. on that night when the enemies of the Lord of all were destroyed. I am the one who is well upon earth before Ra. My mooring post is good before Osir. I fly up as a falcon. I cackle as a goose. I extend the length of eternity. O Ra Atum, Lord of the great temple, the ruler, may he live, prosper, and be well. O Khepri, he who is in his boat, the primeval one, whose body is eternity. I am conceived by Aset, or Isis. I am nurtured by Nebet-Hut, or Nephthys. I am granted the kinship of the sweetness which was created for me. I champion the god. End quote. With passages like these, the reign of Nefertari officially ended on Earth, and began anew in the next world. The queen went to her rest, and entered the annals of history. The History of Egypt podcast is supported by you, the listeners. I would like to thank the folks who recently subscribed to my Patreon as overseers and nobles. These fine folks include Jessica, John, Beth, Jerry, Alexander, Nicholas, Mark, Martine, and Barbara. Folks, you are most generous. Thank you greatly for your support, and I hope you're enjoying the show. I would also like to thank the priests, my top-tier subscribers on Patreon, who give far and away beyond what is deserved. Special thanks to Terry, Dan, Suyon, Frank, Yen, Mykost, Jeffrey, Erin, Karen, Jeanne, Neden, Veronica, Andy and Chelsea, Alicia, Setnart, Chris, Yola, Kate, TJ, Carlos, Dan S., Urjan, Ashley, Eric, and Linda. Folks, you are all most generous. I can't afford to build you a temple to Hathor, but if you bring me a crown, I will place it and secure it upon your head. And I hope you've enjoyed your recent merchandise giveaway. Once again, my thanks to everyone who's listening for supporting the show. I'll see you soon.